Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tabor Talk. Boy, was I fired up yesterday when I looked at my Spotify queue for the JRE, Joe Rogan Experience, and I saw none other than perhaps one of the greatest directors up there anyway, one of my favorite directors, Quentin Tarantino. Oh my God, are you kidding me? I was fired up for that one. My favorite director of all time, by the way, personally, is Stanley Kubrick, but Quentin's right up there too. So, okay, Joe Rogan Experience number 1665. What I want to do here is sort of a timestamp thing. This is an introductory video. I'm going to put up four more. So I've listened to the whole thing, and I'm going through and again, going through the podcast again, and I've taken notes. So when Joe was on YouTube, there there used to be a guy called the timestamp guy, right? So Joe's not on YouTube anymore. No comments, and I really miss that. I even enjoyed going through all the thousands of comments for each podcast as much as I like the podcast itself, but we can't do that anymore. Joe's on Spotify. There are no comments. I've been hearing that they're working on it. Joe's working on it. Joe always complains about comments. Oh, they're so mean and they're awful and they're full of shit. They're horrible. But he really wants to get the comments. It's a really an important part of the show. So, okay, this is just the introductory video. By the way, Quentin looks really good. He was fat for a time. He lost a lot of weight. Quentin's not a good-looking guy. He's a genius, but you can't have everything. Okay, so Joe starts out. He goes, "Man, huge fan. Thank you for doing this. Quentin was very gracious. Really glad to be here." Quentin's been doing it for 30 years. This first film, right? Reservoir Dogs came out in 91, so 30 years he's been doing it. And they talk about initially the story. Quentin, before Reservoir Dogs, Quentin was working at a video store. We all know the story. Quentin's done hundreds of interviews with Charlie Rose and all that. We know the story. There's been much written about it. Quentin Tarantino learned about movies by working at a video store. Was it RKO video store? That was back in the 80s. So he wrote, when he was working there, making minimum wage, by the way, or something like that, but he wrote True Romance. He sold it for $30,000, and then he parlayed that into getting, I don't know how the whole movie stuff works about funding and all this, but he ended up making Reservoir Dogs after this, an absolute classic. Okay, so Joe talks about the Quentin Tarantino style. Joe's not exactly a movie expert critic, but he knows what he likes, and he goes, when you go to see a Quentin Tarantino movie, you're going to get some shit. You're going to see extreme violence, and there's nothing like, you're not going to get into deep character development. I don't know if Quentin liked that so much, but because Quentin Tarantino's obviously more than blowing shit up and all that, and people dying in horrible ways. But anyway, nevertheless, there is a style, and that is absolutely correct. The style of Quentin, but it's not just the violence, it's the time shifts and all that with Quentin, with Pulp Fiction, and then also with Inglourious Bastards, and then or even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the whole Charlie Manson thing, where you play around with history, the what could have, and you play around with that timeline. That is fascinating stuff. So, going back to the beginning here, Joe says, your movies have sort of been grandfathered in. I'm not sure if Quentin laughed. I don't know if he liked that so much. He said, well, we're talking about Charles Manson, one of the most notorious serial killers ever. So I don't know about me and the violence, writing about that being grandfathered in, talking about the Brad Pitt smashing that woman's head against the post. All right, so Quentin made the announcement. He is starting a podcast. Forget the name of the podcast. I'll go back and tell you about it later. I'll put it in the notes, but he's doing it with Roger Avery. Roger Avery helped Quentin write, the good friends, they wrote Pulp Fiction. So they're going to go through movies, I believe, from the 70s and 80s and talk about it. Okay, speaking of terrible time for movies, Quentin says the two worst decades for movies were the 50s and the 80s, right? The 50s because there really wasn't much going on there in terms of movie making. Oh, the foreign movies were, but American movies here, Hollywood, we're talking about. And then the 80s, because of PC culture and self censorship, right? Back in the 70s, my favorite decade for movies, me personally, were the 70s. And I believe Quentin Tarantino believes so too. I mean, we're talking about Coppola with The Godfathers and William Friedkin with The Exorcist and on and on and on, Dog Day Afternoon. And it was usually this Travis Bickle and Martin Scorsese, you know, Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. So the 70s, you had this sort of anti-hero character, right? The 70s, the bad guys, and it didn't always end nice. Very cynical period. With the 80s, it was kind of the nice guy. It was this self-censored bullshit. It was awful, right? So your characters had to be likable. And then he transitioned into talking about, say, he goes, for example, two actors from the 80s. One they liked and one they didn't like so much. Bill Murray, they loved, the critics loved. Chevy Chase, they did not. Now, I never really thought about this, but compare this, right? You think about Bill Murray and all his movies, Stripes and all of his other stuff, Groundhog Day. He's like this cynical, horrible dick asshole, but then he turns into a nice guy. With Chevy Chase, he's an asshole throughout, you know? So he doesn't really change. And so, and Quentin said he'd love to work with Chevy and all that. So I think that's pretty interesting. So what I'm going to do now, I see that I'm almost at 7 minutes. I am going to timestamp the whole thing. And I'll probably break it up into 3 or 4 episodes. And I'm going to put in the timestamps and what the topic is about. So check it out. One of Joe Rogan's best podcasts ever. We're talking about, Joe's been doing it since December 25th of 2009. This is one of his best podcasts. I heard about the Quentin Tarantino podcast coming up. I was fired up, and it lived up. Okay, more to come. Good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience. Peace, love, and understanding here in Tabor Talk.